Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Adam Mickiewicz's poem, The Prisoner's Return, which I'm reading out of the Norton Anthology of World Drama. So first off, The Prisoner's Return, this is not necessarily properly a poem as such. It's an excerpt from a dramatic work called Forefathers' Eve. It's a poetic drama, though. So this is still a poem. It's just not, it wasn't necessarily written as a standalone piece. So that's the preliminary stuff about The Prisoner's Return. Mickiewicz is one of the most important Polish writers of all time. Many would probably say the most important Polish poet. He lived 1798 to 1855, and according to the Norton Anthology introduction here, it says, Mickiewicz's first book of poems, published in 1822, famously marks the beginning of Polish Romanticism. Like other Romantic poets included in his volume, he drew on traditional folk tales and ballads, and he took up mystical themes and stories of unrequited love. All of his work is intensely patriotic and inspired generations of Polish writers and nationalists to follow. So, this introduces us to two really important things. One is he basically invented an entire school of poetry in Poland, or maybe it's more accurate to say he transferred an existing school from Western European countries like the UK, France, and Germany into a Polish context. But he was definitely this major innovator in Polish poetry in terms of its stylistic and thematic approaches, in terms of its attitude toward things like freedom, which, of course, was big for the Romantics in a sort of existential sense, like the freedom to be oneself and express oneself and things like this. But for Mickiewicz, it has a dual meaning, that individual freedom that's so central to the Romantic project, but also the larger national context of Polish national liberation, because at this time, Poland was divided, the largest portion of it being under the control of Russia, but also a large portion being under the control of Prussia, and a smaller portion being under the control of Austria, or Austria-Hungary. And there was a big movement for Polish reunification. And Mickiewicz was, of course, central to this. He was in trouble periodically with the Russian authorities for his nationalist sympathies, nationalist support, and he actually went into exile in order to sort of escape persecution by the Russian authorities. So, The Prisoner's Return. That's actually quite rooted in Mickiewicz's own experiences, because I think it says here, no, I think he was imprisoned, but I can't see where, I can't find that. But yes, he was arrested and imprisoned and then banished to Russia as a young man. So this idea of the prisoner's return, of someone being imprisoned and then released, was actually rooted in Mickiewicz's own experiences. So, basically, the gist of The Prisoner's Return is that the poet persona, the speaker of the poem, wants to know his friend's story, the experiences this friend had while in prison. And the friend is just so psychologically crushed, so terrified of talking, terrified of everyone, that he's basically just an empty, hollowed out shell of a person, and he's unable to recount his own experiences, or even possibly remember his own experiences. So we've got a number of sort of stages here. It starts with the speaker going to find his friend and being shocked by what he sees. So starting around line 6, they told me that a fat but broken down fellow was my friend. His hair had gone, his skin was a puffed sponge that wrinkles burrowed in. Bad food had done it, that and rotten air. I would never have known him sitting there. So again, this is this sort of utterly changed moment where the physical appearance of the person is shifted. In the words of Shakespeare, or to paraphrase Shakespeare probably, neither the inward nor the outward man resembles what it was. And this is kind of the gist of the prisoner's return. And then we go on from there. I said good day. He couldn't place my face. I introduced myself, but not a trace of recognition. And then I reminded him of this and that. His glance grew deep, kept dim, and all his daily tortures, all the fears of sleepless nights, and all the thoughts, the years, I saw, but only for a moment. Then a monstrous veil descended once again. And so again, we've got this element, neither the inward nor the outward man resembles what it was. The friend is physically changed, but he's also mentally changed. He does not remember the poet persona. He doesn't remember their various interactions over the years. And this is rooted in the experiences of torture, of deprivation, of suffering within this prison. And what this friend has learned is to keep mum. This idea from the end of that portion I just read. A monstrous veil descended once again. These sort of flickers of recognition, suggesting that the friend may, on some level, remember the poet persona, but then the prison training of do not know, do not speak, kicks back in, and that recognition is gone. And we get that developed in much more detail later on, this sense of how the fear and the pain and the torture of being imprisoned has shaped this person. The city in a month could not defy the laws that had been taught him year by year. Day was a traitor, sunlight a spy. His fear made turnkeys of his family, hangmen of guests. The door's click meant more questions, more arrests. He'd turn his back, prop head on hand and wait, collecting strength enough to concentrate. His lips pressed tight to make them one thin line. He hid his eyes lest they should give some sign, and any sign might tell them what he thought. And then a little bit later we have this thing. Because his mind was made of prison rock, so that his cell went with him everywhere. This idea that this person has internalized prison, has internalized these norms of torture, of deprivation, of distrust, of suffering, and that has fundamentally reshaped his personality is really central to this poem. So this suffering is central here. And the upshot of this we get at the end of the poem in this last stanza. I thought he'd tell his story in the end. Ex-convicts like to speak to an old friend about their prison days. I'd learn the truth that tyrants hid, the Polish truth. It flourishes in shadows. Its history lives in Siberia where its heroes die, there and in dungeons. But what did my friend say? He said he had forgotten, and with dismay, I listened to his silence. His memory was written upon and deeply, but because it had long rotted in the dark, my friend could not read what was written. We'd better send for God. He will remember and tell us all. So, what I think is really, really interesting about this poem, first off, the psychological complexity is very interesting. The clear and artistically developed sense of the sort of PTSD of people who have been imprisoned, tortured, things like this. But I think the bigger thing here is to read this as a kind of analogy for the experience of Poland itself, right? So again, Poland is at this time divided. The outward man does not resemble what it was. Poland is not a nation at this time. Mickiewicz does not have a country. He has a historical region of which he is a nationalist, but he himself would have been a Russian citizen. My ancestors, a quarter of my ancestors were Russian citizens, but they came from what's now Poland, although they were Jews. They weren't ethnic Poles. But I mean, so medal for him for being a Polish nationalist, in my opinion. But Mickiewicz does not have a country. He has the cultural memory of a country and the aspiration for a country. But the actual country itself is divided and basically annexed by three larger powers. And so this idea of the friend physically being changed, in this sense, this is Poland. Poland is physically changed in that it is divided. It is a nation no longer recognizable, no longer on the map. But then the psychology here, I think the struggle to access memory and how that is sort of undermined by pain and torture and deprivation, detention, all of these things. I think in this case, that's more Mickiewicz's fear than a sort of real diagnosis of what's going on in Poland at this time. This fear that the Polish people will lose their identity through processes of Russification, which was the term in Russian Poland. The idea that Polish culture could be replaced with Russian culture. Kulturkampf in the Prussian section, the culture struggle. The idea that, again, Polish culture could be replaced with Prussian or German culture. And so I think Mickiewicz is really, really concerned, really, really worried here that through these processes of Russification and Kulturkampf, that the Poles will lose their national identity, that neither the inward man, the Poles themselves, Polish identity and culture, nor the outward man, the country as a political entity, will resemble what it was. And so we get that, I think, most clearly hinted at in this final stanza. I'd learned the truth that tyrants hid, the Polish truth. It flourishes in shadows, its history lives in Siberia, where its heroes die there and in dungeons. This idea that those who are really trying to remember Poland are being repressed. I think this is really, really central. And then the other important thing about this, I think, is this idea that the speaker, the poet persona, is trying to get his friend to tell this story, and the friend is unable to. But the poet persona is able to. And so I think Mickiewicz, I mean, he's a romantic poet, remember, so this is sort of standard romantic stuff. The importance of art, the importance of poetry as a form of cultural memory, of preservation, of even political activity. I think Mickiewicz is really leaning into this idea, which again is very, very standard romantic fare. And this poem itself is meant as a sort of antidote to that anticipated or feared cultural amnesia.